Hey everyone, so I don't think I've done a video for the past few days. This week's just been, let's just say it's not groovy. So, I will finish off reading the creepypasta called The Dancer, and I think that'll be tonight's video. It seems to be really long, so it might need to take another episode. So, let's get back into it then, shall we? The alarm woke me up, and I found myself lying on my living room carpet in front of the TV, which was turned to the news. It took me a second to realize that the alarm may have been going for a while. I looked at the clock. It was 8:23 and I was almost late for work. I rushed out of my apartment, not bothering to eat, shave, or even turn off the TV. I ran and barely made the last bus toward my office. I sat down on a seat. The air on the bus was thick with anxiety. Everywhere around me, exhausted eyes were kept awake only by terror. People were jittery, glancing around nervously and tapping themselves to stay awake, fearful of what would happen if they slipped back into sleep. I swore that every so often someone, in their sleepless absent-mindedness, would begin to tap the same irregular rhythm that had haunted my dreams. Though it may have been the exhaustion that clouded my own mind, I am certain that eyes would dart toward them, filled with fearful recognition, until they had stopped the awful sound. Okay, my computer's will charge. People tried to maintain a semblance of normality. Conversations continued in broken and winding sentences, drifting off into the gibberish of a sleepless mind. All around me was the constant noise of a city. The whine of the bus's engine, the squeak of tires, and the conversation of countless faceless people, and the crowds continued. But something was different. Every so often, a noise would come through the endless moan of the city. It was like hearing your name while in a noisy crowd, or the phone ring when you're in the shower. The sounds would meld together to make something they were not. And that sound was a tapping, but not just any tap, the tapping from my dream. Dun dun. I tried to tell myself it was my own imagination, that a lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. But it seemed that a moment of silence that always occurred after it, or the eyes that darted in every direction when it happened. People had heard it and were reacting to it. I was certain of it. I got off the bus and headed straight to work. I ignored the street musicians who, despite having music in front of them, lost track of their place and broke into an all too familiar rhythm. I got to the office and did everything I could not to pay attention to anyone around me. They seemed thankful for my efforts. Everyone around me was too exhausted and too frightened to talk. It was on the tip of our tongues, the misspelling, and no one wanted to say it. There was something wrong, and we all knew it. I returned to my apartment that afternoon. The TV was still on, and I went to turn it off. Just as the screen was turning black, I caught the last snippet of sound. For a second, I was sure I'd heard the word dancer. As quickly as I could, I turned the TV back on. I had missed it, and they had moved on to another conversation. However, the signs were all there. They had the bags under their bloodshot eyes, the loose skin, another typo, the sad, dreary expressions that came from days of constant nightmares. I wasn't the only one. If he existed, the dancer was everywhere. Once again, I had no recollection of going to sleep. Why is it sticking? Okay, reload. I hadn't tried to, and would have done everything I could to stay awake. But there I was. The dream had surrounded me again, and I was trapped inside it until morning. The taps were louder than thunder. The being, whatever it was moving toward me and getting larger. Despite the fact that it was clearly getting nearer, the steps still maintained their distant, hollow sound, the echo and the moment's pause between the sight of disfigured feet hitting the ground and their noise. The being was close to me now. It was close enough that, if it had been facing me, I should have seen its face in detail, down to the pupils in its eyes. However, it had its back turned. I swayed from side to side in its regular, inhuman manner, coming close to letting me see its face. Each time, however, it turned away at the last moment. It was still moving toward me, and if I could have moved away, I would have. However, I could not control my own body, and I was stuck in place. Finally, it began to turn completely toward me. First, it stopped its horrid dance-like movement. Then, its feet twisted around, facing a full 180 degrees from its body. Then, its knees cranked backwards, and slowly its entire body twisted, rattling as it did, toward me. Only 6 minutes? And I saw its face. I woke in complete panic. The alarm hadn't gone off, but my own breathing was louder than it could have been. I stared into the darkness around me, almost in tears from the fright. Everything from the clothes I wore to the carpet beneath me was soaked with sweat. I didn't know what was worse, the image of the face or the vague feeling that it was somehow familiar. In the pale light of an early morning sun, I could make out that I had once again collapsed in my living room. I got up and ran to the nearest light switch and flicked it on. Light flooded my room, only relieving my fright slightly. I looked at my clock. It was 5:45, and on a normal day I would have gone back to sleep. Today, however, the thought of even maybe seeing that thing and its awful face again kept me awake. I got ready. Slowly. I was grateful for the extra time, as every movement took twice as long as it normally did. I fumbled with my buttons and cut myself twice while shaving. Every time I paused for even a moment, I slipped slightly towards unconsciousness, and the horrible, inhuman rhythm filled my ears. I drank as much coffee as I could and headed outside. What did wifey send me? On the bus, all semblance of normalcy had collapsed. No one attempted regular conversation or bothered to hide their terrified jittering and glances around the bus. The sound of the tapping still came at times, and now the reaction wasn't even subtle. The entire bus would turn and stare off in its direction with worried eyes, wondering when it would stop. The bus driver, just as exhausted as everyone else, could barely work. He swerved left and right and almost collided with a tree. Finally, I hit the button and got off, deciding, as many had, to walk the rest of the way. The first thing I noticed was an artist offering sketches for $5. He had a customer but seemed to be struggling to make the face look right. He kept trying over and over again and finally threw the paper down on the ground in front of himself. I saw the edges of the half-drawn face and tried to tell myself they didn't look like the disgusting creature I had seen the night before. The artist, as well as his customer, stared at it in horror. The second one came from a group of children playing by the road. They ran around and flailed their arms, playing and kicking dirt to make lines on the ground. I watched, knowing I would regret seeing what I saw, but unable to turn away. It wasn't long before my horrible suspicions were confirmed, and the lines took shape. Slowly, it became the rough outline of the same face from the dreams. The children didn't seem to notice and continued playing, still jumping around and flailing their arms. I became nauseous watching, and for a moment I was certain one of the children was imitating the inhuman dancing that I had seen. At the time, I still wasn't convinced it was real. It seemed like all the signs were there, but it may have been my imagination. Perhaps I was looking too far into things. Perhaps I was even going insane. That was almost a welcome thought at this point. Even telling myself this was all hallucination and that soon I would be tied in a madhouse until it stopped was better than accepting it. But all thoughts in that direction ended that afternoon. I was working at my desk when I felt something hit me from behind. I looked over to see Carla leaning over me. "Oh, geez, I'm sorry, Gerald," she said. "What? Did you trip?" I asked. "No, I think I just fell. I'm sorry, I've had trouble sleeping. It's that goddamn She stopped as if she suddenly realized she was saying the wrong thing and looked away. I sat up a little straighter and looked toward her. "The dancer," I said in a calm voice. She turned toward me, a look of horror in her eye. Every hand in the office stopped talking, and everyone stopped working. Faces in the office turned toward me, filled with fright and exhausted helplessness. Although hopelessness would work too. "The dancer," she replied. You've seen it too. That thing took?" That was a typo. "That thing from the dreams." "Yes," she said, and others around the office nodded. Did you see what it looked like? What its face was?" I asked. "Yes, just last night. I'm not sure if I remember clearly. Maybe we could figure this out. Get out paper. Let's see if we can draw it." I'm gonna cap tonight's video at 20 minutes. Right now, I can't tell you why I said this. Looking back, it was ridiculous, even insane to try something like that. Perhaps it was the lack of sleep. Perhaps it's just hindsight. Or perhaps it made me do it. But at the time, no one seemed to object. We took out a piece of paper, and someone from the office I hadn't seen much before, but claimed to be able to draw, started working on it. Oh, I'm sorry. That's probably a bad sign if I'm yawning. We all started describing what we remembered, like witnesses describing a criminal to a police artist. None of us could remember it exactly, but we recognized parts of it. An image began to form, and it was one we all knew. The man in the tan jacket? On the piece of paper was the most terrifying face I had ever seen. Its features were sharp and clear. Its cheekbones poked out of its skin, and its cheeks were sunken in like a skeleton's. Its hair was parted on the right side, with a long lick of it extending halfway down to its left eye. Its eyes were narrow and set deep in its skull, but blazed with a look of mischievousness and malicious intent. Its ears were thin and pointed, almost to the point of being inhuman. But worst of all was the cruel, toothy grin that it flashed, as if baring its teeth to bite. The grin was far too wide, with its lips extending too high for any human. We all backed away from drawing. The drawing. Alexa, is it raining outside?
No rain is expected tonight.
So that's just the clacking of the fan. It was a face we had never really seen before, but we all recognized it. It came in 1,000 names that repeated again and again throughout history and in the subconscious of every human. Children today were afraid of the boogeyman. Earlier, it had been Spring-Heeled Jack, the Black Horseman, the Wendigo, Beelzebub, Loki, Prometheus, the Titan, Lucifer. Its limbs were shattered and tortured, as if it were flung from the heavens and shattered on the ground, or tied to a rock to be tortured over and over again, immortal but unable to stop the pain or repair its devastated bones. If it was the origin of the old names, or had taken them afterwards to feed on the fear of its victims, was unclear. But every man knew it. Madmen knew it better. It was what haunted their visions and nightmares. It was the face of fright that every man knew in the deepest reaches of his mind, but couldn't bring out clearly. It was a face scrawled on the walls of madhouses and painted into scenes of torture, something we all told ourselves didn't exist and created 1,000 explanations for it throughout history. The Joker? And it was here, now, in our dreams. I began to hear a noise. We all heard it, though at first we all denied that we had. No one wanted to acknowledge the sound, but there it was. I prayed for a moment that I had slipped into a dream again, but I knew the truth. Excuse me. This wasn't coming from a dream. This wasn't random noise combining into a bizarre semi-hallucination. This was real. 17 minutes coming up. I think we can make it through. All around me was dead silence, except for the tapping of that thing. It was clear and precise. Gone was the hollowness or semblance of an echo. Whatever was making the noise was in the hallway outside the front door of the office. And it was getting closer. I began to back away, slowly. Others did the same, staring toward the door and the origin of the noise. It was getting louder and louder. From the sound, it should have been just outside the door. The doorknob turned, and I screamed. I turned and ran as fast as I could along with everyone else in the room. I didn't dare to look behind me. I ran out the back door of the office, down the stairs, and toward the parking lot. Behind me, I can hear the screams and cries for help of people who knew they faced death. I didn't turn back. There was nothing I could do, and I knew it. I ran as fast as I could. The streets were empty. No cars were moving on the road, and nobody was walking on the sidewalk. Miraculously, though ridiculously would work, there was a bus waiting for me at the stop. Though there was no one waiting beside it, the door was open, inviting me forward. I ran toward the bus, then stopped. The driver was exactly the same as always, except for a horrid, impossibly long grin on his face. He extended an arm forward. The limb twisted and creaked in impossible angles and beckoned me inside. I shook my head and kept running. You're terrified, aren't you, Squidward? I ran as fast as I could. I passed by the same field I had seen the children in earlier. They were still there, or what had once been them was there. They were all staring at me with the same expression as the driver. None of them moved from the spot they stood in, but all of them extended their arms toward me, beckoning me with broken joints. I looked away and kept running. Everywhere I went, it was the same. No one moved, at least not enough to leave the spot they stood on. They all stood staring at me with horrifying grins and waving me towards themselves with arms that twisted in wrong directions. I did everything I could to ignore them, and finally made it home. I locked all my doors, shut my windows, and sat down. I had no idea what to think or what to do. I wasn't sure if it was safe. Something had happened to all those people out there, or it had happened to me. It occurred to me that it was still entirely possible that I was insane. This could all have been a hallucination or a horrid dream. What a welcome thought it was, and one I vainly wished was true. But as much as I tried, I couldn't convince myself it was. The day wore on and became night. I drank all the coffee in my house, trying to stay awake, but deep down I knew it was impossible. The sound was in my ears again, as if it were mere meters away. At first, I thought it was the dream again, but I was wide awake. Oh, hey, there's 20 minutes. It was the middle of the night. I had passed out on the floor, just like each night before it. Unlike those nights, however, I had been woken up by a noise before the dream started. The footsteps were inside my apartment. I got up and bolted for the door. I didn't bother to look around the room, fearing what I would see, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the pointed ears and the terrible grin. I ran out of the now empty apartment building and into my car, which I kept stored for long trips and emergencies. I got inside and drove. I had no idea where I was going as long as it was away. I sped as fast as I could. The streets were completely empty as nothing moved. I ignored all the faces on the side of the road, knowing full well what they would look like and what expression they would have. Once I left the city, I saw no one and passed no other vehicles. I drove all day. Why do you do this? I drove all day, siphoning fuel from the side of the road gas station that was as empty as everything else I passed. Then I kept driving. The world began to seem different. I'm gonna reload the page because it's doing this annoying thing where it doesn't navigate. Quick, back to space, hey. The world began to seem different. Come on, creepypasta, fucking reload. Well, this is a drag. I drove all day, siphoning fuel from a side of the road gas station that was as empty as everything else I passed. Then I kept driving. The world began to seem different. I'm not sure if it really looked different or if it was more of a sense. Things were darker. Light wasn't as light as before, and the sun wasn't as bright. Even in the middle of the day, when the sun was right on top of me, everything seemed dim and cold. The little light I did see appeared a more reddish color, like rust. Or, though I fear to say it, like blood. The sky itself had begun to look different. It changed in an odd way, something like an optical illusion. If I looked at the sky, trying to see it, it was normal, blue with white clouds. But whenever I caught a glimpse of it randomly or saw it out of the corner of my eye, it was different. Much different. The clouds became darker, almost black, and the sky a deep red, like the light I saw all around me. Soon it was nightfall, and once again it was different. Even the dark was darker than normal, and the black was blacker. There are no other words for it. It was more of a sense, an inexplicable feeling rather than outright sight. But I knew it was true. Getting close to the end now, gang. I began to feel my eyelids grow heavy. I knew that if I had kept driving, I would fall asleep at the wheel, just like I had collapsed on the ground the last few nights before. I pulled over. I had put a few 100 miles between myself and that thing. Hopefully, that was enough. So I fell asleep. I awoke again in the morning. The first rays of a dim sun were shining. Ooh, dim sum. Were shining through my windshield. At first I thought I had survived. I looked at the road and considered what to do. Something caught my eye. A distant speck appeared for a moment in my mirror, and it began to get larger and larger. Something was coming toward me, and it didn't take long to figure out what it was. It was there. I could see it clearly now, and even at this distance, it was unmistakable. The random motion, the impossible twitches, the horrid offbeat dancing, and worst of all, okay, people, it's worst with a T, not worse. Just whoever wrote this really needed to do some editing work. Worst of all, the inexplicable sense of dread were all the same. I could hear its footsteps and the cracking of its bones in my ear. I put my foot on the pedal. And drove as fast as I could. I pushed my car to its very limits, trying to get away. That night I stopped again, knowing I was going to pass out. I wished with all my heart I could stay awake longer, but I knew that vicious spell would fall over me and I would collapse soon. I barely made it through half the night. I awoke when it was almost pitch black. Slightly dazed, I wondered what had woken me up. I heard a tapping. Right outside my window was the grinning face of that horrible thing. It was tapping a finger on my window in the same irregular pattern I had heard in my dreams. It danced toward me, never breaking eye contact, never once releasing its smile. I reached toward the handle of my car door. I drove away. Every day and every night it was the same. I moved as quickly as possible, siphoning gas and pushing my car to its limits. And every time I checked the mirror, it was there in the distance. Every time I stopped, it was closer than it was before. Every time I fell asleep, I woke up after a shorter interval to see it standing there and hear its awful sound. I tried to stay awake every night, but somehow sleep always overcame me and I would pass out without realizing it. I became more and more exhausted as my intervals of sleep became shorter and shorter. My car, too, began to wear down. I'd gotten lucky in the first few days, always finding gas stations when I needed them. Gradually, they became further apart and harder to find. Finally, the engine huffed, and it ran out, the final fumes burning out of my car's engine. I sobbed hopelessly. Night was drawing in, and I knew that no matter what I did, the unwanted sleep would come again. This time, I barely slept a minute when I woke up. I felt something on my cheek. Shirley! Its finger was running down my face, slowly caressing it. I looked over. The thing was sitting in the seat beside me, grinning at me. I didn't have the energy to scream, but I felt the tears run down my cheeks. What are you doing under there? I got out the door and ran. I opened the door, got out, and ran. After weeks of barely any sleep, my body could barely move and objected to my commands, but I did what I could. There are few better motivators than mortal fear. I ran as fast and as far as my body would allow. I didn't bother looking back. The entire time I ran, I could hear the tapping of that thing's feet coming up behind me. No matter how fast I moved, they never seemed to get further away. However, every time I stopped, they got closer with frightening speed. Finally, I found what seemed to be an abandoned house. It was a small, single-story building with only one window and one door. It was more of a shack, really. Or maybe a hunting lodge. It had come out of nowhere, the only building I had seen after miles of empty road and forest. For a second I doubted if I should go in. This could easily be a trap of some kind, set up by that being, whatever it was. but I had no other option. I was out of breath and my legs ached and could barely move. I stepped inside and locked the door. There was only one room, which contained inside it a bed, a dining table, a kitchen, and a desk. I locked every window and covered them with furniture and objects I found around the house. The footsteps were getting louder, and I would put anything I could between myself and them. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, not knowing what I would do with it when the time came. I'm not certain if it will even work against whatever that thing is. We're approaching the climax now. It is outside my door now, hammering at it. The pounding is ringing in my ears, and I can hear the door begin to crack. I found the pen and paper for this inside the desk. I don't know if anyone will read this, or even if there is anyone alive to read it. However, I can only hope and pray that someone will come across it and know my story. Maybe then someone can find a way to stop this thing before it's too late. When I grabbed the knife, I told myself I would use it on that thing. However, I knew that this was wishful thinking, and I know that this was wishful thinking, and I doubt there is anything that can stop this creature. There is a way the knife can save me from this thing, however, and I know what I must do. Someone told me that suicide is a sin, but I don't know if there is a God, and you don't fear hell when its evil is outside your door. Credit to Eric AMBM. I completed that in 2 parts. I guess stay tuned tomorrow. We might do something for a bit of a breather episode, because I think Gateway of the Mind and Been Drowned, which are the next 2 up, they're going to be pretty heavy. Nighty night.